Title 42, the Trump-era COVID-19 policy that allowed the U.S. to turn back migrants for health reasons, has officially expired.
Hundreds of thousands of migrants are hoping to enter the United States, but tonight the Biden administration is warning migrants not to believe the lies of smugglers, reiterating the border is not open. Migrants and asylum seekers have been gathering at the U.S.-Mexico border near San Isidro and across the Southwest in huge numbers for weeks, many fleeing persecution, violence, or poverty in their home countries. But disinformation is causing chaos and confusion.
Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the problems that are building at US borders as a result of the removal of what was known as Title 42, a law that was brought in under the Donald Trump administration to allow the rapid expulsion of asylum seekers under health rules that were brought in as part of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in today's video, I'll have a look at the impact that the removal of Title 42 is having on the USA. We'll have a quick look at the details of Title 42 itself. We'll look at the replacement law, which is called Title 8, what the impact of the law change is going to be in terms of border control costs. We'll look at how this is going to affect the 2024 US presidential election. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the impact of this law change is going to be on the USA over the course of the next 3 to 6 months.
U.S. President Joe Biden's administration is preparing for a potential surge in the number of migrants trying to enter the country at the Mexican border starting this week. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas addressed his planned response at a news briefing last month.
We have been preparing for this transition for more than a year and a half. Notwithstanding those preparations, we do expect that encounters at our southern border will increase. Let me be clear. Our border is not open and will not be open after May 11th.
That's when so-called Title 42 regulations expire. The policy from former President Donald Trump's era authorized the rapid expulsion of asylum-seeking migrants during the global health crisis. And migrants have been expelled more than 2.7 million times under Title 42, a total that includes many repeat border crossers.
Title 42 is part of the Code of Federal Regulations in the USA, which is divided into 50 different titles. Now, the provisions included in Title 42 were actually introduced as law in 1944. However, the key section of Title 42, which relates to the expulsion of immigrants for health reasons, is detailed in Chapter 6A, Subchapter 2, Part G, Section 265, which states, whenever the Surgeon General determines that by reason of the existence of any communicable disease in a foreign country, there is serious danger of the introduction of such disease into the United States, and that this danger is so increased by the introduction of persons or property from such country that a suspension of the right to introduce such persons and property is required in the interest of the public health, the Surgeon General, in accordance with regulations approved by the President, shall have the power to prohibit, in whole or in part, the introduction of persons and property from such countries or places, and he shall determine in order to avert such danger, and for such period of time as he may deem necessary for such purpose. So basically the terms of this act allow the USA to close its borders if they determine that there is a health risk as a result of a disease. And in March 2020, at the start of the COVID-19 global pandemic, the Center for Disease Control under the Trump administration issued a public health order which allowed for the rapid expulsion of unauthorized border crossers and asylum seekers as a direct result of COVID-19 concerns. Under this order, migrants would be expelled rather than deported and would therefore not be afforded the right to make a case to stay in the USA before an immigration judge. The practical application of this order was that most migrants subject to Title 42 measures were returned to Mexico within hours of crossing the border. So I think that explains why the USA introduced this policy. But one of the interesting questions is, why has it stayed in place until the 11th of May 2023? Because there are very few other restrictions still in place relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, in June 2021, it was reported that the Biden administration was considering rescinding Title 42. However, no action was actually taken and the law stayed in place. In March 2022, 2 years after the public health order had been raised, The DC Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the Biden administration could continue to swiftly remove migrant families using Title 42, but only to places where they would not be persecuted or tortured. And on the 1st of April 2022, it was officially announced that Title 42 would be rescinded. However, in order to allow for the implementation of a vaccine program to get migrants vaccinated at the border, the policy was not scheduled to officially end until May 2023. Which means that this COVID-19 public health order was actually in place for more than 3 years. So the key question here is, did Title 42 actually make any difference? Did it enable the USA to expel more people? This graph shows the total number of apprehensions and expulsions in the 3 years between March 2020 and March 2023. The blue section at the top of this chart represents regular apprehensions, and the orange section at the bottom represents expulsions under Title 42. And as you can see in the top right-hand corner of this chart, almost 2.8 million people were expelled under Title 42 in this 3-year period. And what this chart shows is that in the period between April 2020 and February 2021, the vast majority of all people who crossed the border into the USA were expelled under Title 42. So these people were basically captured and then taken straight back to the Mexico border. If we now look at what's happened between April 21 and March 23, you can see from the blue section that over the course of the last 2 years, the number of regular apprehensions, so these are people who are being caught, who are then seeking to apply for asylum through the court process in the USA, has actually increased and now represents more than 50% of all of the people who are crossing into the USA. However, the graph does show that there is still a significant portion of expulsion, so people who are just being automatically expelled from the country under public health concerns. And taking a step back and looking at this chart overall, you can see that the trend is that there's been a significant increase in the number of people crossing the border over the course of the last 3 years. And that's obviously one of the concerns from the US's point of view. And in terms of the number of people crossing the border, this chart plots the number of migrant encounters at the US-Mexican border dating back to 1960. And I think this chart's really interesting because between 1960 and 1986, there was a steady and rapid increase in the number of border crossings. Between 86 and 89, there was a fall in the number of crossings. From 1990 to 2000, there was another rapid increase. However, between 2001 and 2018, there was actually a decline in the number of people crossing the border. We saw a spike in 2019, a fall in 2020, which is to be expected because of COVID-19. However, in 2021 and 2022, we saw a huge surge in the number of crossings. And in 2022, the total number hit 2.2 million, which is the highest ever on record. So what this tells us is that the automatic expulsion order that was introduced under Title 42 didn't actually deter the amount of people making the crossing. And in fact, we had a record level in 2022. And if you look at the figures for the first 3 months of 2023, they indicate that we are going to see a huge surge, because if the crossings continue at the current rate of 1 million per quarter, we would be looking at around 4 million. So that would be off the scale in terms of all of the other bars on this chart. So these figures are telling us that it's likely that the USA is going to see an enormous increase in the number of people trying to make the crossing. Now, in terms of what the USA is actually doing with all of these migrants when it was... Now, in terms of where these people... Now, in terms of the Title 42 expulsion order, as we talked about earlier in the video, the vast majority of the people who were making the crossing were removed immediately back to Mexico. And I thought it'd be interesting to have a look at the different nationalities of the people involved. This chart shows the 7 countries with the highest numbers of migrants trying to cross into the USA between March 2020 and March 2023. So you may be thinking, well, where's Mexico on this list? Well, Mexico has been excluded because they obviously represent the largest section of all of the migrants trying to cross over the border. But in terms of the other countries from which a lot of people are coming, the blue section at the bottom is Guatemala, the green section is Honduras, the black section is El Salvador, the brown section is Haiti, the yellow section is Cuba, the red section is Nicaragua, and the light blue section is Venezuela. You can see that Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador represent the three main countries. However, over the course of the last 6 months or so, there has been a significant increase in the number of people from Venezuela. And this chart shows the percentage of migrants that were expelled under Title 42, which is shown in the blue section of the bar chart, and how many are seeking asylum, which is shown in the green section. And we've got data for 3 full years, 2021 and 22, and then for the first quarter of 2023. And what this shows is that the countries that have been supplying the highest number of migrants, which are Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala, in 2021 and 2022, the majority of all of those migrants were expelled under Title 42. And if you look at the figures for Mexico, you can see that in 2021, 89% of all Mexicans crossing the border were expelled immediately under Title 42, and in 2022, the figure was 86%. For Honduras, the figures were 52% and 63% in those 2 years. It was 61% and 67% for Guatemala, and 58% in both 21 and 22 for El Salvador. And if you look at the figures for the first 3 months of 2023, you can see that the USA is still predominantly using Title 42 to return these migrants. 71% of all Mexicans crossing the border were expelled under Title 42 in the first quarter of this year, 54% of all Hondurans, 60% of all Guatemalans, and it was 56% for all of the people who came from El Salvador. So what this is telling us is that the US border controls are still heavily reliant on Title 42 for removing migrants, and now that the USA has had to switch to Title 8, this could cause major problems.
Tonight at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, the pandemic-era Title 42 public health order will end. Starting at midnight, people who arrive at our southern border will be subject to our immigration enforcement authorities under Title 8 of the United States Code.
I understand that they will modify Title 42, which will be replaced by Title 8, but I am not clear what the new restrictions will be.
Let me be clear. The lifting of the Title 42 public health order does not mean our border is open.
Under the new rules, non-Mexican migrant asylum seekers will be rejected if they illegally cross into the U.S. without first applying for and being denied asylum in another country. Migrants must also schedule an appointment at a port of entry using a Customs and Border Patrol app. Failure to follow the rules will result in deportation without the ability to enter the U.S. for at least 5 years, possibly more. More than 20,000 migrants are currently in CBP custody, and U.S. border towns are feeling the pressure, where beds and shelters are in short supply, some already over capacity. The Biden administration is deploying some 1,500 troops to assist border authorities, but officials say the crush of people arriving daily is simply overwhelming.
The rule presumes that those who do not use lawful pathways to enter the United States are ineligible for asylum. It allows the United States, it allows us to remove individuals who do not establish a reasonable fear of persecution in the country of removal.
Mayorkas said the new rule would mean harsher consequences for illegal border crossers, including a 5-year ban from the U.S. if they do not qualify for asylum.
Crossing irregularly is against the law, and those who are not eligible for relief will be quickly returned.
Is the United States ready for the surge of people that's going to come across the border starting later this week?
I spent about close to an hour with the Mexican president today. We're doing all we can. The answer is it remains to be seen. We've gotten overwhelming cooperation from Mexico. We also are in the process of setting up offices in Colombia and other places where someone seeking asylum can go first. But it remains to be seen. It's going to be chaotic for a while.
Migrants have been amassing in Mexico this week, and those who have already crossed into the United States are straining border cities.
In preparation, the Biden administration has announced measures to head off a spike in migrants, including some regulations that resemble Trump-era policies blocked by U.S. courts. The administration plans to ramp up deportations while also expanding legal pathways for would-be migrants. The new rules would also deny asylum for migrants who pass through other nations without seeking protection there first, or who fail to use U.S. legal options for entry.
Processing the surge of applicants is expected to be, in the words of President Biden, chaotic. U.S. Customs and Border Protection has in recent days been holding up to 28,000 migrants at its facilities, far beyond its stated capacity, in what appeared to be a record, according to two federal officials and the Border Patrol's union. The union's president said the busiest border detention facilities are in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas and two areas in Arizona.
The transition to Title VIII processing will be swift and immediate. We have surged 24,000 Border Patrol agents and officers, thousands of troops, contractors, and over 1,000 asylum officers and judges to see this through. We could see very crowded Border Patrol facilities. I cannot overstate the strain on our personnel and our facilities.
As I raised in the meeting, when they said, well, we're going to cut and no spending more money. So what the hell happens? If you cut, you're going to cut people at the border? You're going to cut agents at the border? We need more at the border, not less at the border.
Our focus, as it relates to managing the border, is we're going to do this through enforcement, deterrence, and diplomacy, and that's what you have seen. And we've been working with our regional partners, and we have just few tools that are available to the president, and that's because Congress has failed to act.
I cannot overemphasize that our current situation is the outcome of Congress leaving a broken, outdated immigration system in place for over 2 decades, despite unanimous agreement that we desperately need legislative reform.
Mayorkas also called on Congress to fix what he called a broken immigration system, saying lawmakers failed to provide funds requested by the Biden administration for border agents and facilities.
All this comes ahead of the 2024 presidential election that could have Biden again facing Trump for the White House. The Democrat may be looking to reduce the number of migrants entering the U.S. and blunt the rhetoric of a potential opponent who won his first race on a severely anti-immigrant message.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best.
In response to the expiration of Title 42, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives plans to pass a package of border security measures. They would put tougher constraints on immigrant asylum seekers, resume construction of a wall along the southwest border with Mexico, and expand federal law enforcement.
People who voted for Trump and voted for Republicans are going to believe that Biden didn't do enough.
Biden and Trump already debated border issues in the 2020 campaign and could do so again next year if the former president wins the Republican nomination. Trump leads his primary opponents by a wide margin in current polling.
So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to make this video really to share with you the news of what's happening at the US borders, but also to look at this Title 42 rule, because it was introduced for good reason back in March 2020. At that time, the whole of the world was very concerned about what was happening with the COVID-19 pandemic. It was the first pandemic in most people's lifetimes, and giving the US Border Control authority to remove people automatically did have an element of logic behind it. But one of the big questions is, why did the USA leave that policy in place for a full 3 years? Because all of the restrictions in terms of wearing masks, social distancing, all of the other things that we were doing in 2020 were all removed a long time ago. And as we've seen from the statistics that we looked at earlier, the USA is still relying on Title 42 to remove large numbers of people who are crossing the border either illegally or to seek asylum. But Title 42 has now been removed, and it's been replaced with another title, Title 8. Now, the fact that there's been a change of law doesn't actually make it easier for migrants to be able to settle in the USA. This isn't an invitation for everybody to come over the border and live in the USA for the rest of their lives. In fact, from that point of view, there's really no change. But the problem that the USA has is that it now needs to go through some form of process. It can't just scoop everybody up, put them onto buses and deport everybody back to the Mexican border under the health rules that it was using for Title 42. And the problem that the US has, as we saw earlier in the video, is that there has been a huge increase in the number of people trying to make the crossing. Whether that be because everybody had been waiting for Title 42 to be removed, or there's a misconception that Title 8 allows people people easier entry into the USA. I don't really know why there's a big increase in people trying to make the crossing, but we saw the statistics earlier in the video. If the current rate of crossings continue, 2023 will be a record year in terms of the number of migrants making those crossings. And this is going to cause major problems for the USA, firstly in terms of having sufficient personnel to be able to cope with those volumes of crossings. And then secondly, the cost of housing, managing and processing all of these people and their asylum applications. And of course, immigration and crossings on the US-Mexican border was a really big issue when Donald Trump was voted in as president. So the increases in border controls and the changes in the law are going to be a big factor in the run into the 2024 presidential elections. Now, it's not 100% guaranteed that Donald Trump will be running against Joe Biden, but it's probably likely. And so it's highly possible that we could see a repeat of all of the previous debates talking about what to do in terms of immigration and building the Mexican wall. So the overall summary of today's video is that the rules have now changed in terms of immigration in the USA. There's no longer the automatic right to expel immigrants as they come across the border. And that's going to put more strain on the US border controls. It's going to increase the costs. And this is going to become a political hot potato over the course of the next 12 months. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, interesting and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And here's something to put a smile on your face.